Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waste 360's Nothing Wasted podcast. On every episode, we invite the most interesting people in waste, recycling, and organics to sit down with us and chat candidly about their thoughts, their work, this unique industry, and so much more. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode.
Thank you all for joining me for today's WasteExpo Together Online session. How does your program measure up utilizing data to negotiate your next MRF contract? My name is Stephanie Valentic, Editorial Director of Waste 360, and I will be your moderator today. Now let's get started. I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Keysha Burton, Community Program Manager with the Recycling Partnership. Keisha has a great presentation today, so I'm going to go ahead and hand over the floor to you, Keisha.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I am truly grateful for this opportunity to be here to share with you all of the work that we've been doing around developing better MRF contracts. And here at the Recycling Partnership, we believe that the timing is right for us to have meaningful discussions with industry colleagues that'll help foster much better dialogue across the system and the industry. We have quite a bit to cover today, and I thank you again in advance for all the time that you're going to spend with us today and engage with us in discussion. So let's get started. This is a brief overview of what we're going to touch on today, which is our MRF contract guide and our Essential 11. These are a culmination of lots of collaborative discussions with Murfs, communities, and industry consultants, and really through reading through tons of 40-page MRF contracts. Our guide is designed to be easier to read and digest versus reading through 40-page or more contract. And I don't know about you, but maybe I don't think reading MRF contracts are pretty high on my book reading list, right? But our Essential 11 serve as a guide for developing MRF contracts that lead to a healthy, balanced, and long-term success. So today we're going to dive into what those Essential 11 are and why we believe that they're integral to developing a mutually beneficial MRF contract. The guide is also available now on our website, and you can download it by accessing our website at therecyclingpartnership.org. And if you have any trouble accessing the download, you can also email me. My email will be present at the very end of this presentation. So I want to start by highlighting two key words on this slide here, and those are together and partnership. So partnership is in our name for a reason. We work with all components of our industry, and that includes people, municipalities, and Murfs, because we understand that everyone needs to be engaged in helping to engage in order to help build and transform our system for good. I also want to remind everyone that the Recycling Partnership is a nonprofit 501c3, and we are formed for the public good. So here's a look at all the organizations that fund us and have signed on to help us transform recycling for good. These organizations help support our mission to empower people to protect the planet by advancing recycling and helping the circular economy. So in short, we are rooted in working together to make a difference. So how do we get there? Well, we started off with infrastructure grants, but in the 6 to 7 years that we've done that, we have also grown, right? And so we've worked with plenty of communities across the country to help optimize our recycling programs by reducing inbound contamination, but also increasing participation and capture. We also work with regional and state organizations to help improve the recycling system, but we also foster peer-to-peer networks, such as our state leaders group and our municipal coordinators group on Facebook. But we have also hosted, pre-COVID in 2019, a conference where we invited 50 city recycling coordinators to come together and to meet and to talk about their programs and their issues. And that subsequently led to their ability to basically pick up the phone and call each other and to make those connections after this conference to continue to have that dialogue. We also develop resources. We have various best management practices and guides, much like the one we're going to go over today. And those guides are developed through extensive research and collecting data that allow us to continue to build on the resources that we provide to communities that'll continue to help and support our goal of transforming recycling for good. So on this slide, I want to highlight why we do it, the major importance behind it. And that's because all of our work is rooted in the important recycling impacts. We know that recycling helps create jobs, but it also helps lead to reduction in carbon footprint as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And so even though these metrics may seem very sobering, they also highlight why there so many of us work within this field. We're also driven by the public support of recycling. It's important for us to remember that we should be keeping our finger on the pulse of what the public thinks about recycling. 84% believe that recycling is valuable, and look what they're willing to pay for better recycling. So we should be asking ourselves, are they willing to pay more for a recycling system that is better and sustainable? And our survey says yes, they are. So in order to facilitate that for our communities, we need to come to an understanding that recycling is a system approach, and we have to all be working together in order to make a difference. And at the partnership, we try to bring all those stakeholders together in order to do that. And our guide is a healthy, it provides a way for communities to develop a healthy and balanced and mutually beneficial contract between themselves and their MRF, right? And we know that that mutually beneficial relationship is a critical component to ensuring that we have a healthy recycling system. We believe it's critical because we know that there are many contracts that are currently out there that are missing key elements. And that's not healthy for MRFs, for communities, or the system overall. Another understanding that we should really come to is that there are new norms around contamination and market value. New complexities essentially mean that there is a need for new definitions between MRFs and communities that'll help strengthen the recycling system. If you're looking at this slide, you'll note that it's a pie chart of all of the recycling facilities, the MRFs in the United States. 79% of those MRFs are privately owned, where 20% of the MRFs are publicly owned. So that's essentially 4 out of 5 MRFs that are privately owned. However, the majority of the curbside collection services are operated by or contracted through public agency. So what does that knowledge base tell us? It tells us that there's going to be a lot of contracts developed, but also those contracts are going to be developed within a highly privatized MRF infrastructure system. And so it's going to be very important for both the needs of the community and the MRFs to be addressed within those contracts. And we believe that our guide is a good way of helping communities and MRF come to a mutually beneficial contract. So the way that we support them in doing this is by having communities identify that there are mutual goals and independent goals when we're developing contracts. However, the mutual goals of the contract should be greater than any independent goal that the community or the MRF may have. A community's independent goal may be predictability, while the MRF's independent goal may be profitability, but we want them to be met in the middle. And so the main focus of the contract, in order for to have a mutually beneficial contract, will be supporting the mutual goals of having stability, long-term vision, clear communication, and addressing material quality. So how do we get there? Well, we know that both of the community and the MRF needs to live through a wide range of market conditions. Having contracts sustain MRF and community relationships through good and bad times is going to be critical for an ideal contract. Again, I want to stress here the importance of having balance, because I've said that a lot, having a healthy and balanced contract, but it's really going to be integral through weathering through those good and bad times, right? The goal is that the community and the MRF should share in the risk and the rewards. All of the risk should not be on one party, nor should all the rewards be one-sided either. So we need to look at our MRF contracts and our relationship with our MRF and the community as a relationship. There needs to be good communication between both, a balanced approach, and lots of collaboration. So both the community and the MRF should be working together and communicating regularly with each other. And so you want to build into that your contract mechanisms that allow for both the MRF and the community to be engaging and checking in with each other. So the community should be including in their contracts a check-in for their MRF on how are things going, right? What is the inbound contamination looking like for your community? And also, what are the market conditions that are currently underway within the community? What's impacting the market? So these are all questions that the community should be engaging in with their MRF, so that way everyone is on the same page, right? So ideally, you want to set very clear expectations within your contract for the level of communication that you want to have with your MRF. Additionally, you also want to have very clear expectations on what is accepted in your program and what's also considered inbound contamination, as well as building to your contract the ability to have flexibility to adjust as needed, right? So before we jump into the essential 11s that we're going to be discussing, I also want to step back and talk about the general scoping and procurement process, because before we get to actual language in the contract, we should have the foundation of how we get there touched on first. So I'm going to start with this question here, and we'll come back to it a little bit later in the presentation. But the primary question that you as a community person who's going to undertake developing a contract should be asking is, what are your community's goals and priorities? Take some time to identify these goals by engaging with essential stakeholders. And this means stepping outside of DPW to engage with your budget, purchasing, elected officials, any key stakeholder that could assist in answering these questions. Once you have those critical stakeholders involved, this will ensure that you gain key perspectives that need to be taken into consideration from the very beginning, right? These are the goals. The goal here is to essentially align internally on what your community's needs and goals are and work together to achieve them. It's also going to be really critical to understand the link between a bid and the actual contract. So your procurement department or your purchasing manager is going to play an integral role here, because procurement and contracts go hand in hand. And the design of your documents should anticipate the development of the contract clauses that's going to be reflected in the final proposal and bids that your vendor, the Murfs, or your potential vendor, the Murfs, are going to actually remit to you. And where we start in our actual guide is kind of building on that foundation of the scoping and the contracting process, right? We essentially encourage you to consider all the strategic elements that you're going to need to address, that you're going to need to have addressed as you're beginning your procurement process. So on this slide, we're going to kind of start with the beginning. I'm not going to go into great detail on what each individual type of instrument are, but I'm going to touch on some key things here. So if you're going through the contracting process, you may decide that you need to do a request for information, which is an RFI. And that's because you're going to be looking to get better understanding of the processing perspective. And then that in itself could turn into a request for qualification that you then eventually turn into a request for bid or a request for proposal, right? But each of these vehicles have their own pros and cons, and I'm not going to go in depth on them because they're also touched on in our guide. But you need to determine as a community which of these instruments for the contracting process is going to be the lever that you're going to use. Another key factor in developing your contracting process is determining the type of relationship you want to have with your MRF. Do you want to have a public-private partnership, or are you looking to have a private service agreement where essentially the MRF itself does all the actual operation, contract out for the service directly? Another key element is also going to be timing. Timing is really integral because you'll need to determine how much time you'll need to actually go through the entire RFP process. You'll also need to understand essentially the lay of the land when it comes to the MRFs within your community, right? Do you have any MRFs that are actually within the community that can process your material? Do you live in an area where there is no MRF, or your MRF doesn't have the capacity to accept any more new material? Are you looking to have a new vendor come in and build a MRF within your community? So all of these things you need to determine for yourself as a community and build and factor those into how you develop your contract. So again, having an understanding of the start of the process is going to be critical as you're building out language for your contracts. And the next thing I'm going to talk about here is essentially contract length. So local governments should essentially plan to include terms and conditions and even a sample contract when possible. And the reason for this is because, one, if you include a sample contract, it keeps both you as a community and you as a community and your Murph on the same page in terms of your contractual expectations, as well as the pricing for the services that you're requesting. But it also helps to streamline the process as well. In particular, if vendors are asked to identify exceptions as a part of their submittal process. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on this slide, but I do want to note that this particular slide identifies the various approaches and strategies that are available for communities to take as they're developing or determining the type of contract process that they want to engage in. And this is also available in the guide. This slide here presents a general overview of the timeline of all of the activities that should occur as you're going through the actual contracting process. So essentially from left to right, what we're seeing is local governments will assist with the assistance of a consultant or not, will then develop an RFP or the contract itself. Vendors will then develop the proposal, and then from there, it'll go back to local government where it'll go through an evaluation process. There'll be some negotiation, and then there'll be an awarding. And from there, we transition into the final phase, which is the implementation phase of things. So the amount of time that you need to do this in order to accomplish contracting with an existing Murph versus a new Murph will definitely vary. And so this procurement schedule essentially highlights that. So this reflects the time that we think it would take for a community to go through the contracting process for an existing Murph. And it's shown that there is a minimum of 90 days that a community could go through the contracting process with an existing Murph. Now, this is a minimum, so we don't recommend it, but we know that there are times where there are time constraints where this does occur at this speed. What we really want you to do is to make sure that you are giving yourself, you're giving all parties enough time to be on the same page. And so more time is better than less. This slide reflects the amount of time that can be taken to develop the contract when working through with a new Murph development, right? So this presents, there's more complexities, more sets of requirements that need to be addressed. And this is because new Murphs are indicative of having to have new design. You'll need to build a structure, understand construction costs and labor, and all the construction costs are associated with developing a new Murph in your community. And so that could take easily between 1 to 2 years. Circling again talking about the contract length and how this all plays a part in that. And contract length is really important. It's important because the Murph needs sufficient time to recover the capital cost, right? So we also want to make sure recovering those capital costs don't preclude market choice over time, right? So what we recommend is a definitive period of time be identified within your contract for your Murph. And so you could build in time that also helps you to make your contract more desirable for new Murph infrastructure. So the way that you go about that is just having a better understanding of what the needs are for your community and how long the length of time would be needed in order for the Murph to recover those capital costs. This table is included also in the guide, and so it makes recommendation based on the varying contract types that are available. For the interest of time, I'm actually not going to go over this as well, but it is in the guide, and so I do encourage you again to download the guide if you want to have a more detailed view of the different contract lengths and the pros and cons that go along with them. And so here's where we kind of start our deep dive into our essential 11, right? So here's the essential 11 elements that we believe are essential for a good, healthy Murph contract. These are the foundation. So each of these are going to be discussed in depth within our guide. And the guide also includes sample languages within the appendix, and there are also case studies as well too. So for us, you wouldn't look at a Murph contract and consider it a really good and strong contract if it didn't include all of these key elements here. This slide is a visual representation of the essential 11. So if you notice at the core of this slide is the transactional relationship between the Murph and the community. And that would be the processing fees as well as the revenue share. The other elements just essentially orbit around those transactional relationship, but they're also essential and very integral in their own right. So this generic, there are generic examples. This is a generic example of blended values around the country. So this is general, and it doesn't take into account like regional variances or impacts. But what you can see here is that the cost, the material cost doesn't carry the day over the actual cost of processing. So we just want to be mindful of that. But I will make a note that the markets have performed a lot better this year. So blended value is dynamic, and there are certainly things that can continue to move the value up as we've been seeing so far this year, but we're seeing more domestic capacity for paper coming online. The markets are pretty strong in terms of some plastics. We've definitely seen some strengthening on the polypropylene side as it relates to like particular resins have been very positive as well. So there are just some key elements that continue to help take up the blended value that we've been seeing throughout the year. And based on those trends, we anticipate it to hold really out throughout to the end of the year at least. And these are factors that essentially bring the blended market value down, right? So we know that there are changes in domestic aluminum industry where there are soft used beverage can prices. There's cheap virgin plastics as well. They're impacting that. And of course, contamination is also weighed in to the blended value. So a lot of our work is also centered around helping communities head that off, at least on the contamination side as well, by instituting anti-contamination efforts. So one thing that we also need to note about processing costs is that Murfs cannot operate at a loss. As we've seen, material value does not carry the cost to operate the Murph. So there needs to be balance within the contract to ensure that the Murph can continue to operate, right? I'm now going to dig into our Essential 11. This is essential element number 1, which is essentially processing costs, right? Again, Murphs cannot sustain a loss on every inbound ton, and material value doesn't presently cover the processing costs. But the one thing that we do need to recognize is that processing charges are here to stay, right? And for that reason, Murphs need to be very clear about that, and it needs to be expressed and addressed explicitly within the contract. This is just some data that we have on processing charges across the country. So we know that the West Coast data shows that there's an average of $74 a ton. Our state of curbside report reflects that there's an average of $65. And then community stories are saying there's upwards of $91. And we have definitely heard that there are communities that are experiencing well over $100 per ton. But again, what we do know is that processing charges are here to stay. And so it just needs to be addressed effectively within the contract. So on this screen here, what you're seeing is generic language that represents that, right? In the guide, we talk about this further, and we have more examples in Appendix B that you can review. But in your contracts, we want to see that the processing charges are spelled out and it's made explicit as to what they are. Essential element number 2 is revenue sharing. So these are, there are markets for materials, whether the markets are performing well or not. We know that there are markets for material and that the materials are being sold, and therefore their revenue should be discussed within your MRF contract. Even if the contract means that as a community, you're giving 100% of those revenues back to the MRF, you should still be engaged in that dialogue within the contracting process. So as a community, you should be considering what's best for your community as it relates to revenue sharing, right? What are the goals around revenue sharing that needs to be a part of your MRF contract? And again, the one thing that I want to point out here is that when it comes to revenue sharing, they also work very closely with Murph performance, as well as the Murph's ability to make capital investment. So if you do have revenue sharing in, we have to be mindful not to take too much revenue share away from the Murph, because this limits their ability to continue investing in equipment and technology and infrastructure that will help support the system in the long run. This is essential element number 3, which is material value determination. So what we want you to look at is published prices versus actual prices and make a determination as to what's best. So one option could be, if you don't know which one is better for you, one option could be to specify that both of these are referenced, but you accept the payment based on the higher of the two, right? And we also recognize that actual sales can exceed the index prices, but essentially you want to incentivize the Murph to pursue the best prices that are available, right? But you don't want to undermine the stable market conditions either. This slide reflects just emerging patterns that we're seeing in capture, which is commodities that tend to have higher capture rates are cardboard, newsprint, and glass. And the lower capture rates include aluminum, PET, and colored HDPE. And the average participant capture rate here is reflected across all commodities. As you can see, aluminum cans are roughly at 53% capture rate. We have PET bottles at 55%. And so the reason why we're looking at that is because this also weighs into the material mix and how we engage with our Murph on deciding what those will be. So as a community, you need to decide based on your participation and what's included in your mix, you need to decide and have a really good understanding with your Murph as to what's going to be accepted, right? And how to address the various mix and flexibility for changing things out over time as needed. So the contract should be revisit the list of what's accepted and what's not accepted. And a vehicle that you can use to have those dialogues and engagement with your Murph would be our Murph Survey. This survey allows for your Murph to essentially indicate what's accepted, what's not accepted and considered detrimental, what's considered non-detrimental, or what is considered what they don't accept, but they know it has an additional market. So you could access this resource on our website as well too. It's also embedded within our anti-contamination toolkit for download, but you could use it within your own Murph contracting process in order to gain better insight as to what your Murph accepts. And then now that you know what your Murph accepts, or once you have identified the material stream that you want to include in your mix, you should also be including essential element number 5, which is inbound audits, right? Unfortunately, I have definitely seen some contracts where this is not made explicit or even touched on at all within their contracts. And this is also a disservice, right? So essentially, your composition studies are going to set a standard here. And they are going to be built off of your material mix in terms of what's considered a commodity that's accepted versus a contaminant. And ideally, when you're factoring your inbound audits, you want to do this at least once a year, which isn't really ideal because I don't think that frequency is enough, but you should be considering doing a material audit at your Murph at least once per quarter. Right. And then you'll also need to identify for your inbound audit, what is the methodology for doing that, right? Are you going to do a waste sort, a waste analysis? What's the methodology that you need to have it this conducted under for your inbound audits? And then you need to set your reporting parameters and identify exactly how all of this information is going to be used to help better your contract and your relationship with the Murph. Essential element number 6 is material quality and contamination. So again, this is a point where you could have really good conversation about standards of how contamination is going to be defined and measured and addressed with your Murph, right? So there should be an incentive there should be either a transactional relationship around this or a mechanism for the community that will allow them to address the inbound contamination. So there are 3 types of contamination. there's inbound contamination, and there is the commodity bale and residue. But we're going to focus for a moment on the inbound contamination, because this is the contamination that is within the community's control. And this will have, this will also be impacting the contracting process as you go forward, right? So communities who are using private haulers should also be keeping in mind the inbound contamination and how those haulers can be engaged to also help control this as well. Right? But you want to build into your contract dynamic features that allow you, that are incentivizing everyone to reduce the inbound contamination over time. So this slide reflects a difference in inbound contamination rates. And so what we note here, this is from our state of curbside restudy. And so what we note here on this slide is that 1/3 of communities, roughly 17%, actually knew what their contamination rate was. So I've worked with a lot of communities, and I know that this is an area that they struggle with as well, is just kind of understanding where they fall with their contamination rate versus their Murfs residue. And so when a community doesn't know their contamination rate, this is an indicator that communities need to have a much better discussion with their Murfs around auditing and building in mechanisms that will allow the Murph to share clear information with them, so that as a community, you can address the contamination that is within your control. And so why are we focused on inbound contaminations? Because again, this is the part of the contamination that is within the control of the community. And so the inbound contamination will also impact the better blended values, which then leads to how this impacts the transactional relationship with the Murph, right? So as a community, the inbound contamination can be addressed relatively effectively, and it can be done through implementing any anti-contamination efforts, such as our Feet on the Street program. And this will help yield better quality and help support, and can be supported over time through media and advertising and direct engagement. And so again, we want our communities to really focus on the contamination that they can control to help continue to improve the blended value for their material stream. Murph and communities can also work together to address contamination. So an example of this is working together is our Atlanta project. So in this particular project, we were focused on reducing the contamination at the curb, and we also targeted a top issue material contaminant that was in the stream, which was plastic bags. But what we found was that when you target and you do a targeted anti-contamination effort within the community, you get a double benefit of, one, not only addressing the contamination and seeing that reduction, but you also see an increase in capture, as you can see on this slide here. The city of Atlanta had a 27% increase in their capture rate, but their actual focus was on addressing contamination at the curb. So there's double benefits to tackling inbound contamination. Additional work around this that supports an anti-contamination effort on addressing inbound contamination is centered around our work in Ohio. So we've also deployed a Feet on the Street model within about 5 to 6 Ohio communities. And our target was to improve the quality of their inbound material. And what this yielded was also improved blended value of material. So the material that's coming to Murph was much cleaner. And so that also resulted in a boost to their blended value. So the MRF contracts should essentially facilitate these types of actions benefiting both sides. Essential element number 7 are rejected loads and residue disposal, right? So I talked a lot about anti-contamination work and how that can be addressed from the community. But we also need to be realistic that anti-contamination efforts, despite the best laid effort and the best laid plan, you will have an issue where some loads will just simply be contaminated. So this should be included in the MRF contract. We need to spell out within those contracts what are the actual protocols and standards for identifying and addressing when those loads are rejected and how they're going to be handled. Another point that I want to include here is that you want to make sure that any loads that go inbound to the MRF, if they're going to be rejected, they should be highly documented, and there should be a relationship built in with your MRF that allows for an exchange of this information. So ideally, we want it to be documented. It should include pictures, and hopefully you'll embed within that contract the ability to have to have information on the weight, volume, and the origin of the load. Because what that'll let you do is pivot back to developing some targeted campaign or determining if there's a targeted campaign that needs to be done within a certain region to address that inbound contamination. This is a MRF material tracking form that you could also use to track material inbound loads or coming into the MRF and identifying when they're being when they need to be rejected. This is also included in our anti-contamination toolkit as well too. And again, you can download these on our website at recyclingpartnership.org. So now, kind of pivoting away from the inbound contamination, let's talk a little bit about the role of the MRF. Like, what is the job of the MRF? The MRF's job is to convert all the inbound commodities they receive into outbound commodities. And the expectation is that those commodities are going to be baled into high quality bales. And then their third primary role is to keep good commodities out of the residue. So that means we want to also have in our contract, we want to address MRF performance. So we want you to be asking, is your MRF clicking on all cylinders? Are they working well? Are they making the necessary investments that will continue to support the system over time, right? And the way that we do that is setting very clear expectations about the standards for marketing our marketing material, because that's going to incentivize the MRF to maintain good standards. And so one way of doing that is an approach you can use to do that is addressing what is your minimum marketing for material for your inbound commodities. You could set a standard of the MRF has to market 95% of all inbound commodities, or you can identify each commodity stream and set standards for each of those each individual commodities as well. But all this needs to be explicit and included within the MRF contract. There are some other factors that might affect the cost as well. And so some of those could result in adjustments within the contract, such as, is the community going to haul the waste for the MRF? Will the community accept the residual that is outbound from the MRF on the back end? So those are some of the things that could impact the overall value and cost of the actual contract. And these are discussions that, as a community, you need to be thinking about as you're building your contract. So again, there's hauling services, discounted disposal services. All of these things may affect the relationship between the MRF and the community, but you definitely should be exploring this and having really meaningful conversation through your contracting process. But regardless of whatever option you choose, if you choose to bundle services or not, this will all really be dependent upon those primary goals where we're asking previously, what is the goal of the community? What are the priorities? Essential element number 9 is outreach support. And so here is one that is kind of near and dear to my heart, because I'm a big proponent of doing really good, clear communication outreach for our communities, right? But in our contracts, we need to be explicit and we need to be definitive. It needs to be defined better within MRF contracts, the role of the MRF in the community as it relates to outreach support for the actual programs, right? So outreach within the community is a really good way for both the MRF and the community to work together in order to kind of really address and educate around quality. And the reason why this is important, again, is because we're focused on what can be controlled at the curb, which is the inbound contamination. But both the MRF and the communities can do this together. And so one way that they could do this is the MRF could essentially be asked to host tours. Pre-COVID, this was made a lot of sense. Dynamics may change, after COVID, but there could still be a potential for hosting virtual tours. Maybe the MRF can host a more innovative educational website They can also support the outreach by dedicating a set amount per ton that can be used to help fund the outreach and education within the community. So this means that this funding, one, gets shielded from the actual budget process as you go for a municipality. So you know you have a set budget amount that'll go dedicated towards supporting your outreach need for your program. And though that can in turn be used to help support annual information mailers for your resident. You could do TV and radio and social ads and signage and essentially build out a robust education and awareness plan for your community. And because we make a lot of resources available on our website, again, we do have a campaign builder and a DIY sign builder that communities can use today. Both of these builders will essentially allow you to customize and create printable pieces that you can deploy within your community today. They can also be used digitally. This is our campaign builder output where you'll see you can also develop the information card that can go out annually, more frequently if you so choose, but this will also produce OOPS tags if you're going to deploy an anti-contamination strategic plan within your community as well too, and also includes a top issue mailer. Essential element number 10 is addressing contingencies. So I want to note that this is where we should be addressing what happens if the MRF cannot operate. So now, like in Louisiana, unfortunately, they had that hurricane come through and it's a natural disaster, right? And that community has to address upon other things, dealing with the post cleanup and recovery of their community. But waste and recycling services will still have to come back online, and what happens when they cannot. What happens if there is a fire? We've had communities over the years have fire in their processing facilities, and that essentially will impact their collection services and their ability to have those materials recycled. So what happens under those conditions? And I want to highlight that your contingency plan is really focused on like short-term impacts to operation, not long-term. And so contingency is not a force majeure, right? So again, we want to make sure that you are addressing in your contracts the what happens or the what if scenario for short-term issues to your MRF. Essential element number 11 is reporting and communication. And so this is kind of self-explanatory. Essentially, we want you to be building into your contracts the relationship where you're able to obtain from your MRF on an identified basis or a frequency that works best for you. We recommend monthly, but at minimum quarterly. You should be getting a report from your MRF about what is going on at the MRF. What's your inbound tonnage? What's your inbound contamination rate? What's your commodity mix? What are the market values? We want all of this information should be coming to you in a digestible manner, at least monthly. We prefer monthly, but at least quarterly. And then you should also be considering site visits because you're working with the MRF. Again, we want this to be a relationship. You want to be able to go to the MRF and just kind of see what's going on. This can be done through site visits or even hosting meetings at your MRF if we don't have COVID running amok, I guess. But if they're not hosting virtual meetings, but they're hosting in-person meetings, can meetings be hosted at your actual MRF? This allows you to kind of continue to build that relationship with them. And then another key element in the reporting and communication is weight tickets. You want to be able to verify what the MRF is communicating to you in these reports, and the weight tickets are one way of doing that. So you want to have all these kind of factored in to reporting and communications with your MRF. So really sit and think intentionally about what is it that you want to gain from your relationship with the MRF? What kind of communication do you want to level set on? And the reason you want this information is, ideally, it's to help you determine your program performance, right? And so this slide highlights our municipal measurement program. And this program is a tool that's used to help you measure your program performance. You can input your metrics for your curbside recycling program, your drop-off program, your organics, your multifamily recycling program. And then what it'll do is it'll customize and provide to you some recommendations and solutions for making improvements to your system. And this can be done year over year as well. So it's a really good way to quickly calculate and receive a report out on your program's overall metrics. And so it's also a free tool to use. The link is also embedded within this deck. So I'm also gonna now come back to the beginning, which is identifying what are your community's goals and what are your priorities. You should be considering what your needs are and work collaboratively together to meet them, to achieve those goals and needs. And as long as you're keeping that top of mind, you'll get to the middle ground that ensures that you have a healthy and balanced and mutually beneficial contract. And this is where I'm going to end it, where we're going to pivot into questions.
Thank you so much, Keisha, for your presentation. It was absolutely fantastic. I do have a couple more questions to ask you before we end this session. So first, how can a community attract more Murfs to bid? So the one thing that a community can do to attract a Murf to bid is consider your contract length, right? So we know that a community, that the Murf needs to market the material or advertise material for at least 1 to 2, maybe even 3 years. What's going to be really advantageous for them is having a 7 to 10 year contract, and maybe some options also included in there, some optional renewals. So those are going to be really key elements to consider is the contract length, and that might incentivize the community to come in. Another component that you could look at is, will there be other communities whose material can also come into the Murf? So you want to consider all those facets: contract length and the actual tonnage material that the Murf can expect to process. Thank you so much. So are all of these elements that you listed, are these all of the essential elements that should be a focus when developing a Murf contract, or are there any other ones that you would like to comment on?
So no, these aren't the only elements that should be included in the contract. It's going to be essential that local government also includes in their contract things like insurance, health, safety protocols, general performances that are required within their municipality as well, that they'll need to meet and what have you. But all of these things are important, but the essential elements are just included to help ensure that we have a good balance approach between the community and the Murf as it relates to the recycling system.
So how has COVID affected processing charges?
That's a good question. So processing charges in COVID, COVID has been really interesting, right? And that's because we've seen that Murfs, it's kind of pushed Murfs in 2 different ways, right? Because we've seen Murfs that have been investing in equipment and technology, and they've also expanded in capacity as well. But we've also seen, because of COVID, where some of the communities were feeling the squeeze of budget deficits. So those are the ways that COVID has distinctly really impacted processing charges. But the one thing that we want to remember is that blended values were present before COVID, and so they will continue to be present after COVID.
Fantastic. So one last quick question. Should we separate our hauling contract from our processing contract?
So separating out hauling from the processing is going to require an evaluating pros and cons, right? So there are pros and cons to everything. Murph services are a special element of a community's recycling program, right? And so the best option is probably bundling everything, right? If possible, you want to just do it all in one efficient contract. However, let's say you live in a market where there is good, healthy competition. It might make sense for you as a local government to separate out your processing because you have the market competition available for you to do so. So it really is going to come down to what's available within your community, what's the landscape looking like in your community, what are the market constraints looking like, and then deciding like whether or not bundling or unbundling makes the most sense for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation and for answering these questions. Make sure to mark your calendar for WasteExpo 2022. We'll be back in sunny Las Vegas, May 9th through the 12th in the new West Hall. Stay well and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for listening. It would mean the world if you would take a moment to rate or review this podcast. And if you share it with us on one of our social networks, we are giving out some fun Nothing Wasted podcast swag. So just tag us and see what you get. Thanks so much.